Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland, and here I am in Alexander Pope's garden. That's the celebrated 18th century British poet. So this area is also known as Cross Deep or Pope's Grotto. Before Alexander Pope came along, Cross Deep. The name is mostly returned. A grotto, of course, is derived from the Latin word for cave, but it's not really a cave. It's a sort of a basement. It's underground rooms which are only open to the public a couple of times a year. Not quite beneath our feet, beneath modern buildings, mostly Radnor House School over that way. You can't really make it out. It's behind those trees. So Alexander Pope was born in London in 1788. Where I'm now standing is considered well within the confines of London, but at the time it wasn't. London was only about a mile around St Paul's Cathedral. So ominously he was born the year of the 1688 Revolution, or the Glorious Revolution, as its partisans would have us call it. And he belonged to that tiny minority of Englishmen who were Catholics. And James II was the king until, of course, he ran away in November 1688. I shan't recount the whole story of that revolution, but William III came along, and there was a new parliament which passed all sorts of anti-Catholic legislation. So Catholics weren't permitted to reside within 10 miles of London. So his father had been a very wealthy merchant, and he retired to Windsor Forest, which was beyond the limit. So therefore he was permitted to reside there. And that's a bit further west of where we are now. And so this locale really formed much of Pope's muse as a child, and well into his adulthood. It wasn't just his juvenilia, where he composed poesy about these idyllic sylvan scenes and mythical animals, and his education was mostly the classics, Latin and ancient Greek. So you should dip into some of these, but they seem very stylized now. They're obviously very dated, unsurprisingly. So because he was a Catholic, there were almost no schools he could go to, and he certainly couldn't go to the only two universities in England, Oxford or Cambridge, because that would have required him to abjure Catholicism, or to swear oaths that he believed the 39 Articles of the Church of England and various doctrines which are abhorrent to a Roman Catholic. No Catholic could swear such an oath in good conscience. But his talent became noted by the local gentry, and they had him come and declaim some of his verses for them, and they helped to further his education by having tutors go to help him with his craft of poetry. So he never worked a stroke in his life as such, was a gentleman of leisure because they were such an affluent family. And he also suffered from some severe illness, some severe spinal deformation, so he was only about 4'6". I know people were shorter in those days, but they weren't that short. An average man might have been about 5'6" back then, so 4'6" was far below average. And indeed, he never wed. How do they come by the surname Pope? I'm presuming because in the 16th century, they did not cross the Tiber to become members of the Church of England. Perhaps that's why they're given the surname Pope, because surnames weren't heritable in England until the 14th century. I know this is sometime afterwards, the 16th century, but that's my stab at it. I don't know quite how far back his ancestry can be traced, because I thought surely it's not a coincidence that he was a papist and his surname was indeed Pope. Anyway, so he moved to live around Twickenham, and despite his membership of this apostate religion, as most Englishmen would have perceived at the time, he was well received by the great and the good, and he had many Anglican friends, many prominent aristocrats. He was a close confidant of Horace Walpole, the son of the first Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole. And indeed, Horace Walpole's house, Strawberry Hill, well, is just out of sight, just that way. It's now a university, a Catholic university indeed, St Mary's University. So this is a bit of the gazebo of Pope's garden, as in a bathhouse. So I wonder if it was a full wall around it. You see the tiles would match of water splashed around it, because of course there was no flowing water back then, no running water. You have to get water from the Thames and heat it up, boil it, let it cool a bit, such that it was good enough for people to get into. One thing is it might have also been filthy because it was an open sewer as well as everything else, but this is a sufficiently rural area. Twickenham was a village, that there wasn't that much filth in there. The centre of London, the Thames water really was foul. People used to drink small beer, even children, beer with under 1% alcohol content, just because it had been distilled, so it was cleaner. The river water was too foul to drink, could kill you. and people were reluctant to take baths, and so everybody stank. You might have seen that, what's it called, the Shogun, that 80s film about some English sailor who's stranded in Japan, and the Japanese force him to take a bath, and he's fighting against it, say it'll make you sick. Anyway, and here's one of the other buildings. I doubt the wood is original of Pope's garden. Anyway, he died in 1744, and he's left much to posterity. The Dunciad, for example, and he's quite into bathos in poetry. The Rape of the Lock, which is a sort of skit on the rape of Lucretia, the rape of the Sabines, or bizarrely, rape being considered a well-regarded theme for classical poetry, and not even in verses that were particularly sympathetic towards the victim of the crime. But by the lock, he means a lock of hair. He doesn't mean an actual lock with a lock and key. So it's a pastiche of earlier classical poetry. So George II was very impressed with him. George II had come to this country as a teenager, but did master English, and so he got audiences with His Britannic Majesty, who was able to set aside sectarian prejudice and appreciate this versifier. And that he even wrote a little ditty to go on the collar of His Majesty's dog at Kew Palace, which is only about 3 miles away from here. Maybe palace is too grand a word. Kew House in Kew Garden, saying, "I am His Majesty's dog at Kew, pray sir, whose dog are you?" He even wrote a poem which is about one of St. Paul's epistles. You know, this dying Christian to his soul. Grave, where is thy victory? Death, where is thy sting? And so on. So there are lots of things in his poems I don't quite understand, like strophes and anti-strophes mean something or other in Greek about the special verses, chorus of youths and virgins, but it's all just so perfectly crafted, le mot juste, and paying attention not just to the rhyme, but also the meter. I don't know whether it's iambic pentameter or didactic pentameter or whatever. I didn't study it close enough, but I warmly recommend the poetry of Alexander Pope. Anyway, after he died in 1744, he was still wildly popular. Unfortunately, he's a bit unfashionable now, and hardly anybody reads his stuff. He's buried in a church in Twickenham, only about 1.5 miles that way, by Twickenham High Street. And the house here was inherited by William Stanhope, but unfortunately torn down sometime later. Is mostly the site of what's now Radnor House School, and that's not the first building built on that site. Behind those trees, the old building was destroyed by a bomb in 1940, a Luftwaffe bomb, and then a new building was constructed on the site. And then that's actually where Henry Labouchere lived, or the Labouchere Amendment, the notorious Liberal MP, homophobe. So in Pope's time, there was a brook running through here, and little footbridges, and the further half of this lawn was an eight, that's to say an island of the Thames. An eight is an island of the River Thames, and only in the River Thames, not in any other river in the world. You can see an eight beyond, that is an island of the Thames. The other bank of the Thames you can't see, that's beyond that. So it's an awful shame that they tore it down, because he was so admired by many people that many tourists used to come here after his death. There's a bit of an artistic community in Twickenham, and this was considered to be in the county of Middlesex, were north of the River Thames back then, not in Greater London, not until 1889. So I must go and have a look at his grave sometime. I've not been along to the church when it's been open. I would like to go into the grotto one day, but I've got to find out when that is. Well, that is enough about Alexander Pope, and here at what we call Alexander Pope's Grotto. It's not the actual grotto here, or Cross Steep.